Welcome to this edition of the Men's Room Show. I am very excited to have Max Wilson on our show today. And the topic that we are going to be exploring today is how modeling vulnerability can be our superpower. But men don't always do this because there are reasons behind why they might be in that man box. They might be masking who they are and showing up in ways that they feel that they should be showing up and more. And so really, today is all about taking that deeper dive, that one that doesn't always surface, and bringing it so that we have a level of awareness, that there can be acceptance, and that men can take different actions. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Max to tell us a little bit about how he even found himself advocating in this space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda, for that awesome introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be on the show. So thank you for that, for this opportunity. Yeah, how I found myself in the space, really, really interesting and powerful question if I look back to my sort of experience. And as you were talking about vulnerability there, Brené Brown's quote came to my mind, which is vulnerability is the first thing I look for in you, but the last thing I want you to see in me. And that's very much been my journey with this. So I started out my career as a lawyer. I was a barrister in London. And I came into that world not knowing much about the sort of ancient traditions of the bar, about the legal space. Didn't come from family of lawyers or anything like that. But I was always very driven. I was always a high achiever. And for me, what was really important at that time was about sort of climbing the ladder, proving myself to others, getting that external validation. And that's what I did. I climbed and I climbed and I got what's called a pupillage, a tenancy, a decent set in London. And my career as a lawyer started. But what I didn't realize at that time is I'd set myself on the course of the corporate treadmill, on the course of the wounded masculine, as it were, which I'll come on to. And I was also heavily masked up, I would say, when I went into the profession. So I was always conscious about how I looked, how I came across, what I said, to make sure that nobody could judge me. That was the feeling at the time. And I tucked a lot of stuff away behind the scenes. I was coming to terms with my sexual identity. I was coming to terms with mental health issues around anxiety. I was coming to terms with this self-employed world that I found myself in the legal space and didn't really know how to manage it. But I shoved it all down, tucked it all away, and I hid. And every day I'd wear a mask. And every day I wore that mask, it became more and more and more and more tiring. It depleted more and more and more of myself. And I reached a point where I developed crippling anxiety. And I shoved it down. I became overwhelmed with managing my practice alongside dealing with mental health issues and all the other life stuff that happens. And I shoved it down. I didn't talk to anybody about any of the stuff. And then I developed disc problems in my back, which I still have to this day. I'm sitting down for hours straight, 10 hours straight without a break. And I shoved that down as well. And I shoved everything down until I couldn't shove it down anymore. And then like a jack in the box, it all just popped out. And how that manifested for me was quite severe panic disorder. So I literally couldn't get on a tube. I couldn't get on a bus. I couldn't go to the cinema. I I couldn't do normal day-to-day activities without having panic attack. Extremely physical sensation if people haven't had them before. It's nothing to do with the mind. It's obviously interlinked to the mind. It's where it starts in the amygdala, the threat response to the brain. But the actual symptoms of a panic attack are extremely physical. You feel like you're going to die in the moment. So I'd have those pretty much every day, sometimes a couple of times a day. And even then, I shoved that down. And that makes me cringe thinking that that's the person that I was. But it also makes me very compassionate because I know there's a lot of guys out there that are in exactly that boat. And so I reached a real rock bottom where I knew I couldn't go on doing what I was doing any longer. I had to have change in my life. And I was therefore kicked metaphorically into the self-development world, or catapulted into that world. And I had to change. There was no other option. And that's when I started doing the work on myself. And I realized how much of a driver I had in me to just go at all costs, regardless of health, regardless of, everyone around me. And it's so common in this modern day and age to have that driver. Yeah, I'll pause there. There's loads I could say on this. I don't want it just to be me talking at you.
I'm taking in everything that you've been sharing with us. And what I'm hearing is, as you're going through those different stages in your life where you're coming to terms with the things that you've mentioned, anxiety, sexuality, you were getting more overwhelmed. And as you went through, you would stuff it down, stuff it down, stuff it down. And your body, because we're not listening to those cues, your body started to try and give you cues as well. And so panic disorder is very real. I've experienced it myself. And so I hear you loudly when you're talking about how that is. And it puts you into this place too, where other things begin to happen. You talk about your back beginning to have issues.
Yeah.
And so it will continue to manifest. So, a lot of men want to keep pushing it down, pushing it down, pushing it down. It will surface in ways that you can't even begin to describe. And it's very interesting that as you were going through all these experiences, working in a highly technical field, that you ended up being placed in the perfect space where personal and professional development came together, where you could take that logical driven man that you are and get to the point where you can go to that, I want to call it softer skills, softer side of yourself, and do that internal work. And it takes courage and bravery to go into that space. And, a lot of people, men especially, aren't going to bring to the surface that they're struggling in all these areas because society says you're going to power through, push through. That's what driven, successful men do. And so at that moment, you're still that driven, successful man, but he's got to take the time to take care of himself. And the reason why I was so excited about us talking today is because that wounded man that you were has come to the other side, and he's helping by sharing his own vulnerability and making it safe and okay to have the conversation. Because we know when we have the conversation, we can have compassion and kindness, not only for others, but we can turn it around and have it for ourselves. And so why wouldn't we do that? And I'm seeing a shift, a very positive shift of more and more men reaching out and helping that other man. And so instead of being shoulder to shoulder and not looking anywhere but straight ahead, we're like turning to our left, we're turning to our right, and we're actually saying, hey man, I can see you're upset, or I can see that you've got a lot on your plate. Can we talk about, what's going on here? Because I see you're showing up in this way that's not helpful to you. And
Mm,
and so really more conversations are starting to happen because individuals such as yourself are investing in others in a
mm.
way that can give them support and encouragement and guidance to get there. And I guess, it always comes back to that dance that we play between that logical self, because we can explain all the reasons why we
Yeah.
might be going through something, but that emotional self, that expression that needs to come out,
Mm,
there's always that power struggle. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that man box
mm.
versus the whole masking up scenario. I want us to go a
Yeah.
little bit deeper and explore this.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for reflecting those things back to me as well. I really appreciate that. And it's interesting there's a quote, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but just the whispers get louder and turned into screams. And that's what happened for me with that drive towards self-development. So there are people listening who've got those whispers, act now, because you don't want to wait till the screams, trust me. And you don't need to be waiting for the screams. And actually, in the work that I do, I help more men get into their self-development space and help themselves out before they're on the floor screaming. Um, but yeah, I think for me, I talk about it in terms of three um, metaphors, really. So I talk about the mask that we wear. So we're given a mask, we're given a man box, and we're given a corporate treadmill. And these are the three things that we're given as men. Now, the wounded masculine, which I'll talk about, affects everybody, not just men. Um, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of men. Um, so I'll start with the sort of wounded masculine. I think ever since sort of the beginning of time, or for a very, very long time, um, there have been there's been sort of a split in terms of men and women and their roles and those sorts of things in society. Um, and if you look all the way back to sort of hunter-gatherer times, there was more equality, or more equality of opportunity. There wasn't this patriarchy in the way that we see it now, but sort of relatively shortly after that, we're looking at things historically, um, we saw sort of warriorhood, which is men going into battle essentially, and fighting, and that um, that sort of patriarchal shift, that male dominance shift, was a thread that carried throughout history, and we're seeing the horrific effects of it today, still, unfortunately, um, with that sort of wounded masculine leading. And literally, for many generations, men have been taught to be warriors until they die. And even now, in the corporate space, we're still taught to be warriors until we die, to go at things at all costs. Um, and burnout rates are through the roof. Mental health crises are very, very real. And it's because of the wounded masculine world that we live in, right? So, simple way that I explain it is there's, there's always sort of two different energies in balance, right? There's that active doing energy that allows us to get stuff done, achieve goals, move forward in life. And then there's that sort of more subtle receptive energy that allows us to connect and have empathy and you know uh, sort of have intuition and listen to our feelings, those sorts of things. And they're not gender specific. They've been labeled as gender specific because of society, but they're not gender specific. These are qualities that reside within all of us. The problem is at the macro level, we're operating from not only a masculine only sort of stance, but a wounded masculine stance. What I mean by that is that in the corporate space, we're taught to strive at all costs, push through, um, dominate, compete, live in fear, as opposed to a more healthy form of masculinity, which would look at sort of, more discernment, more structure, um, you know, um, sort of an awareness, but a more measured sort of active energy. Yeah. But we're not leading from that place. We're leading from the wounded masculine place. And essentially what that means is we're given a corporate treadmill, I say metaphorically, we run on it at all costs until we burn out or drop dead, essentially. And I know that sounds overly dramatic, but if we look at statistics, that's literally what is happening. I'm talking about if you don't do the work and do the personal development work and look after yourself. I think it was Herbert Benson said that around 60 to 90% of physician visits in the US by men are driven by stress. Right? But what we have seen is sort of a great resignation from that wounded masculine following COVID. Yeah. On that macro level, we're seeing organizations move well-being more center stage. We're seeing men's groups pop up sort of as a guerrilla movement, right? To help each other to grow. So we are seeing a resignation from the wounded masculine, but that's very much the world that we live in. And the thing I want to say about that side is we have to have both energies to operate, right? We have to have that softer, more compassionate, intuitive side balanced with the structure and the more active side. Otherwise, what happens is we will just burn out. And I always use the example of like a tree, right? A tree has roots and it has a clear structure, right? That's holding it up, its trunk. But it also has leaves off of the branches. And the leaves couldn't grow without the trunk and the roots. But then the tree wouldn't survive if there weren't any leaves that are expanding and helping it grow. So it's got to have that balance of energy. And it's no different from us. We require both. But we're forced in society, especially men are encouraged in society to go at it at all costs. But as I said, it's not exclusive to men, but I'll come on to it with the man box in a moment. But that's very much the society that we tend to live in, right? So that's the sort of first part of it, I say. And then we have what's called the man box, which is basically a set of rules that were given very early on in life. So it was a guy called Paul Kivel that introduced the term in a book called Act Like a Man. And Tony Porter developed that term. But basically, the idea is that the man box is a set of rules that we're given. And those rules are very, very clear from a very young age. Yeah. We don't speak about emotions, don't be different. Don't act in a way that could be perceived as feminine. Okay? So it's misogynistic as well, in terms of its messaging. So you hear kids say to other kids, don't be a sissy. So there's that degradation of the feminine already at that early age. Don't be different. So if you have any difference, or don't speak up about your emotions. So if you cry on the playground, you're shut down. Sometimes if parents see the kid cry, shut them down. They're a boy, boys don't cry. That messaging, if it's driven at that early age, comes out in adulthood. But the problem is, when it comes out in adulthood, our only blueprint that we've got to live from is the man box. And if we're cast outside of our tribe, all the guys that are subscribing to the man box, we are different. We are speaking about emotions. We need to because we're having a mental health crisis. We do any of those things, we're cast out. And then we have to navigate these choppy waters by ourselves. We don't have any blueprint of what that looks like, right? How do we move forward once we've broken one of those rules? And that's why it's great that there are these men's groups popping up because men do need men, to support each other and grow. And there's no need to suffer in silence and isolation. It's great that that's all happening. But many, many, many men, without probably realizing it, are still living life according to the rules of the man box, the outdated rules of the man box. And then on top of that, the only sort of saving grace we're given is a mask. So shove on your mask and hide everything away when it all becomes too much. So that's the sort of analogies I would use to describe the experience. Yeah, from my perspective and my journey through this as well.
So those analogies that you use give us a very visual interpretation upon what's been happening, both through upbringing, what society says, and, you know, the whole, I guess, idea around, okay, how do we help men to have these supportive spaces where they can
Mm.
actually have those conversations? And so I'm curious, if there isn't a formal place in the workplace, and
Mm.
maybe there's not a place you know where to go to in your
Mm.
community, in your family, what have you seen, or what do you do that creates those spaces?
Mm.
What does it take to create those spaces? Does it take someone such as myself, who's a woman who advocates for men's wellness and well-being, to create the space? Does it uh help to model as a mother how I raise my sons, to so they're not, so they have a blueprint as they're maturing from boys to men? Because I think that
Mm.
having that education from mothers, teachers, fathers, on what that can look like.
Mm.
But we all know that what's really needed in the world doesn't always come through the education system. It doesn't always come
Yeah.
through our parents. It has to be by the people we choose to surround ourselves with. And so if you're not surrounding yourself with people that can help you, then it makes it really harder to shift what society has shown, to change and redirect it in a more positive, healthy way.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. It's a fantastic point. And I just want to acknowledge the great work that you do, because it's so critically important. Um, not only to provide a space for men, but also to provide that space as a woman, essentially. And we need more representation like that, in these spaces as well. Um, I mean, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because if we look really far back in history, we used to see that boys were given initiations into manhood. So they would have sort of rites of passage. They'd have challenges around separation from, their mothers, and they would gently learn how to separate, and how to go out into the world and essentially become healthy men. And then they would return as elders with their boon, their sort of gift to society. And then the healthy elders would teach. I know this is massively overly generalized, but the elders would sort of teach the other men in the tribe about their experiences. We don't have any of that anymore, right? So all we have is these limited tools at our disposal. So we absolutely need groups. We need tribes. We've always needed a tribe, and um, I run one called the Vulnerability Club, which is about owning our vulnerability as a superpower for men, especially men that might not fit into those alpha male stereotype models. I think there's a space for that, but there's spaces like what you host for yourself. So women's support as well is critically important. I think in a heterosexual relationship, for wives to show up and say that they support their their partner, leaning into that, those softer energies, that feminine energy, and actually, advocating that as a strength when they see it. Because the problem is, what can happen is, women inadvertently can condition men as well, not to cry on those things, because of the conditioning that they received as well. And that's not to blame women at all. It's the message that we've been fed, and women have been fed themselves, about emotional vulnerability. So checking in with yourself as well, in the relationship, can be really useful. But yeah, what I've seen is that the men that I work with on a one-to-one come into my practice and basically say, um, I'm going through X, Y, and Z. Am I alone with this? I have these thoughts in my head that say sometimes that I'm not enough, or I'm not good enough, and I'm not like the rest of them. I must be alone with that. Or I have some men that come in and say, I've just reached a point where I can't do this anymore. I'm just completely burnt out with everything. But when I go into work, I feel like I can't tell anyone that. I can't share that with anybody. So I have to wear this mask. I've got men that come in and say, and this is very common, they bolt up at 3, 4 in the morning, because that's when our natural cortisol spike happens. But when you add that extra layer of stress, the things they're worrying about, it's a very common experience. So all these men are coming in saying, am I alone? All these men are feeling isolated without any support. When the reality is, having done this work with a lot of men, there's so much commonality between their experience and actually with my own personal experience. But what we haven't done is been able to connect the dots and see that we're not alone. We haven't had elders to come in and say, right, actually, you know, this is what's happening high level. This is why you feel like you do. You're okay. It's okay to be different, sort of thing. Um, and what these groups provide is exactly that, a space to be able to take off our masks. And the first time that I went into a group and took off my mask was terrifying. But as soon as I did, it all just came out. And I think that's the beauty with modeling vulnerability is that once everyone in that space agrees, and it has to be everybody agrees to take off their mask, what you see is men really talking. And they talk a lot. So there's a lot of like stigma around men don't talk, all those sort of things. They don't until they get into a room, right? Usually speaking. I mean, statistically, I think only like half of men who have mental health issues actually seek out therapy. But once you get men into a room, generally speaking, most men will talk. And the more that they talk, the better they become and the easier it becomes. And then the more they want to model vulnerability to other people, right? And, and I can share my own personal journey on that, which in a nutshell is I would never have told anybody that I was experiencing anxiety ever. That had to be kept in a box and not revealed. My closest unit I might have told, but not even the full extent. Now I'm talking to you on a public podcast about it, right? That's the growth that can happen from doing the work. And I had vulnerability models to me, and I'm now in a place because I've done work myself to model that vulnerability to others to hopefully help other men. But that's possible for everybody. But it just takes finding a space to rock up, and there's plenty of them. You type in men's groups in your local area, or there's online groups. It's a Mankind Project. I run British Club. You run, the men's room and your groups. They're everywhere, but you just got to, type it in on Google, whatever, do the research. But once you get yourself into one of those spaces, trust me, you will see your life change for the better.
Thank you for sharing that. There are many of them out there, but it's going to take an openness and willingness to take that first step and go in and try out some of the different groups to see which ones fit, because I know there's several different types, online, in person. There are some men only, there are some mixed groups, and the only way to know if you found your tribe is to show up and take that first step. But there's so many men, they're so scared to show up, because you talked about it, it requires taking off the way that people see you and getting past that fear of that you're going to be judged. If anything, you're a man that goes into one of these spaces and one man's telling his story, and then that opens up another and another. The chances are pretty good that if you open up, one of the guys is going to say, I experienced that too. And I got through it. Or I experienced that and it was really hard. And I'm so glad that I'm here. And making that welcoming space. A lot of us, if we ask for someone to listen to us or to help us, most people want to do that. But you can't receive if you don't ask, and you can't get started if you don't put that foot forward. And really, I guess where I wanted to go with this is the more people such as ourselves do this work and people get to experience what good feels like, that like you can be at your rock bottom, but you could still go into a group and then you can have that weight lifted.
Mm.
and then you could get services and support and all of these things, then you're like thinking, well, why didn't I do this sooner?
Mm.
Well, we don't want to have to admit that we need help from somebody. And,
Yeah.
because in a lot of places and spaces, we're seen as these um, very successful people, individuals, wherever we are.
Mm.
And to come to a place and say that that I'm not all right, that I need support, um, it's really a hard place to be in. Um,
Mm.
I'll just share a little bit about part of my journey. I was in a very difficult space, a toxic place. And I remember walking down the hall, and one of the persons that was a peer in one of my groups asked me how I was. And I thought, you know what? I'm not all right, and I just need someone to talk to. So I said that I wasn't all right. And then they said, well, come into my office right now. And they sat me down. We had a little bit of a heart to heart. I was tearing up, of course. But I felt so much better because somebody actually listen to that response that no, I'm not all right. And yes, I do need to talk, but I didn't know how to ask for it. But at least I was able to, in that moment, be vulnerable enough to the idea that maybe this person could help me because I had worked with
Mm.
them in other areas and I knew that they were a person that could have that capability. And boy, was I happy when they came through and that was just one experience. But what if I just would have said I'm fine and I went walking down the hallway and then I just kept it stepped in, didn't share it. And,
Mm.
I got I could get a panic attack or any of these other things that could, happen, just really be stressed out. But I chose
Yeah.
to see what could happen because I thought that the person in their experience that I've had with them before, they felt safe to me.
Mm.
Hmm.
Mm.
And there are people like
Yeah.
that. You just have to know
Yeah.
how to, I guess, look for it.
Thank you for sharing that. And I would say I've definitely had very similar experiences. And if you had said to me, "How are you?" 99% of the time, I'd say, "Yeah, I'm all right. How are you doing?"
Hmm.
Bit of a smile, maybe sometimes. You would not know, and I would not let you know. Um, and I remember even sitting down in some meetings, and the leg would go, and then the brain would start to, space out. And I always thought, what does this look like from the outside? Are people clocking on? And then sometimes people would look at me, and I'd think, oh, do they know? Do they know what's going on here? Um, and it's horrible to think that that's the space that I was in. But there were a few people who said, you know, you sure you're okay? Or really close friends that took me to one side and said, you know, you really do need to get some support now. This is this is getting a lot. And, it's the old expression, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. I didn't want to drink the water until I was ready, but it took me a big spiral down to the bottom before I was ready. Um, but the sort of lesson with that is that if nothing changes, nothing changes. Yeah, sounds very simple, but it's a very powerful statement. If you do not change anything, nothing will change for you. And things just get worse and worse and worse if you're in that sort of critical state. So, to prevent the snowball, just reaching out to someone close to you. If you feel like you don't have the energy to reach out to, a men's group or anything like that at the moment, just someone close to you, let them know that at least this is going on for you. Um, but the chances are, people will meet you with open arms because at the end of the day, we're all wired towards connection and we are genuinely interested in what's going on in somebody else's life. Even though we're sort of conditioned to say, "Hi, how are you?" "Yeah, I'm okay. How are you?" Or at least that's my sort of experience of it. Um, but it's, yeah, a large part of this is all around the modeling of vulnerability, which you've already talked about, but also visibility. More people like us talking about this stuff so that more people can then go on their journeys and talk about this stuff. And then we create this culture where it's okay to say, actually, you sure you're right? You seem clocked, past couple of weeks haven't been yourself. I just want to check in with you, make sure you are okay. Whatever those conversations look like, um, rather than this stoicism that's driven constantly, especially in the corporate world, just press on at all costs, we talked about earlier. So, yeah, I think, it is a leap of faith. And I think, we can't ignore that. And that's certainly my experience of it. But it doesn't have to be a big jump off a cliff. Um, and, what it can be instead is just some small steps down. So what's the smallest action you can take that's going to move you forward? So whether that's, speaking to a doctor, speaking to a close friend, um, joining a men's group, um, buying a book about anxiety or depression or whatever it is, watching some YouTube content, but just engaging with the idea of moving forward from where you are and sowing that seed um, is the most important thing, and it will eventually sprout. Because I think once you've opened that door of self-development work, it can't be closed in a very positive way. But it just takes that first step, as you said.
I like what you said there about asking yourself the question, what's the smallest thing that I can do? Because a lot of times in our brain, we're like, okay, what's the biggest thing that I can do that's going to get me the biggest bang for my buck, the thing that's going to get me the quick fix? And
Mm,
no, we're looking at what's the small little step I could take that I know I could do. And maybe I could ask somebody to support me in taking this step, or at least asking if I've taken this step. That
mm,
seems like it's a lot less riskier when you're looking at
mm.
what's a little thing I can do, because we all can think of something little, even if it
Yeah.
was just sitting in calm for 30 seconds and just trying to breathe through to get our
Mm,
grounding, to get that center so we're not in that flight fight or flight stage where our heart is pounding out of our chest and we are just feeling so anxious and so raw and open and thinking that we're getting triggered by something, let's say, and
mm,
just to slow it down, calm it down, do something small. I think that's really great advice. uh,
mm,
they talk about it in the workplace. You chunk things out. Instead of one
mm.
big, huge deadline or project, you do little things. Same works for any of the things that we've talked about today. Little
Yeah.
tiny steps incrementally will move us forward in the best way. And to get out of our head and listen to our intuition, listen to our bodies, because our bodies will tell us when things are off,
Mm,
misaligned, and we should listen to those cues rather than stuff them down. And, you know,
mm.
you had mentioned that a lot of these things aren't gender specific. That is true.
Yeah.
The whole shutting down, stuffing it, getting through until you have time to unpack it and take a look
Mm,
at it. However, that way of living is very tiring, and
mm.
it's
Yeah.
draining to wear that mask and not ask for help, and to say you're all right and go through the motions. But the moment you start to live differently, which is again being vulnerable,
Mm,
asking for what you need, allowing other people to help you, and um, it just gets lighter and easier as you go through. But I have to say that you and I can speak to these things for hours on end. But what it's going to
mm,
take is for the individual to have to take the actions, be the person that changes, to actually understand what we're speaking to. So
mm,
when a person begins to be in that place where they know what good feels like, they will never
mm.
turn back and do or be the things that were causing them the distress in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so powerful. Yeah. Just thinking back to my experience
Mm-hmm.
in relation to that, and that really rings. true, the more you see the fruits bear, the more you want to do the work. Um, and that's why it's a door that's never closed, because once you start the journey of that growth, so you put that foot forward and engage, um, things only get better from that point. And I think for me, looking back, the first step actually was understanding what the hell was going on. Because I thought, anxiety sounds such a feeble word, let's be honest, right? Someone has anxiety. Anxiety, when we say we're anxious, it doesn't give it credit as to how physical anxiety as a condition is. It's all consuming and makes you feel like you're going to die and collapse on the spot. Anxiety for me doesn't really do it justice. Maybe nervous illness, maybe nervous system sensitization. I don't know, something that gives credit to the physicality, the body experience. But that's one of the challenges I had initially. I was like, this is not anxiety. This is like, there's all sorts going on here with like palpitations and then sudden like lightheadedness and feeling like I'm going to drop to the floor, my body goes cold, or being really spaced out and not know what's going on. I was like, this is not anxiety, guys. I've got all sorts of problems going on. And of course, I didn't. I didn't at all. It was anxiety. And so that, that's my experience of that. But, if you're going through depression or whatever it is, um, whatever it looks like in terms of the mental health side, um, it's the first step is understanding. And I think for even depression, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, often that can show up as like digestive issues or headaches. So it may be manifesting in that physical side. So if you're getting regular physical symptoms, chances are, obviously go to the doctor, but chances are it's probably linked to something else actually going on mentally. So the body and the mind are interlinked. Understanding that connection, but also understanding the physicality can really help as well, because it can help to know that you're not alone, and it can help to understand and fear it a bit less. Um, and also it can help you understand what support it is that you need going forwards. And I tried a variety of things between talking therapy, CBT, which is really helpful for me, cognitive behavioral therapy, um, to, yeah, lots and lots of different things. Um, and you've got to find what works for you. And sometimes it's a combination of different modalities. That can really work. So, coaching works really well alongside therapy as well. To support you to move forward as whilst you're working through stuff. But just having someone in your corner to help you move forward can feel really nice as well. Someone who really understands and gets it, what's going on, that sort of non-judgmental space. Yeah, I think is critical.
I agree. Having someone that can be in your space to be able to walk beside you as you're going through, and like you said, it, there's so many different modalities, and so it's finding the right ones for you and the right combination. And I like to share with people, if you're not
Mhm.
sure if a modality will work for you, try it out. Maybe try it a
Mhm.
couple times. And if it doesn't work for you, then that's okay. It just means it wasn't meant for you. I think we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do we get in alignment. And I also advocate and share that when you're in alignment, you don't have to ask if you're in alignment. You can feel it in your whole entire body and nervous system. When
Yes.
you're in
Yeah.
alignment, when like you're in a really good relationship with a person, you don't feel
Mm.
anxiety when they appear in the room. You don't feel like you need to withhold how you speak to them. All these other things. I'm
Yes.
trying to use an
Yeah.
example that people can relate to. You're happy to see the person. You feel really comfortable, and you don't have to pretend to be anybody else. And
Mm.
honestly, you could misstep and say the wrong thing, but at the end of the day, if it's a good, healthy relationship, you can talk it out
Mm.
and figure out what could have been done differently, and then have the other person give you the autonomy to try again and work through it. Um,
Mm.
and so that's
Yeah.
really, an example that I think that holds true.
Yeah. It's very much the first step for a lot of people. It was for me, the first step towards taking off our mask in that really safe space where I felt like I wouldn't be judged. I did go through a couple of people to make sure we were a good fit, and I was like, this is someone I can take my mask off with. But it still took quite a few sessions before I was ready to do that. And I'm talking just about anxiety to a therapist. I was that ashamed of it. It took a few sessions. Um, but once I'd managed to do that, I took my mask off in other spaces and I spoke to some friends, and friends were like, no, I've gone through the same. This is how it manifests for me. And then I was like, wow, so actually this is happening for a lot of guys. And then I joined a men's group, and then they were like, no, an even bigger group. This is what's happening for us. I was like, ah. And then I started to speak about it a little bit more publicly. And then now I'm in a space when I'm speaking to you. So, you know, the the more we can learn to do that, he talks about alignment, the more we can align with our true selves and the more satisfaction we can get out of life, right? Um, because I love Carl Jung's quote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. So underneath all the layers, underneath all the hiding, underneath all the covering up, just to show up in the world as yourself is incredible, an incredible feeling. And it's a journey to get there. But the first step is to go into that space where you can take off the mask for the first time.
Yes, because it really requires being discerning, and you mentioned this, and I want to bring it back to the forefront, is that not everyone is a good candidate for the person you're going to express your vulnerability with. So you will
Mm,
have little moments of vulnerability, and you'll see how they respond and how you feel, and then you go from there. And all too often people say, I'm not going to open up because every time I do, it's used against me. Please don't
mm,
let that stop you from becoming vulnerable, because when the right person is there and you're discerning and you've tested the waters and it's all good and it feels great, you will
mm,
be able to figure out who you can open up to, and who you might be a little bit more cautiously curious about opening up
mm,
to. And that's okay. Not You don't have to open up and explain anything to everyone. You have your few people that you can. They have you in return. And it really is that simple.
mm.
However, it's taken many of us a lifetime, or
Yeah.
most of our lifetime that we have right now, to get to that point. And that's okay, because some people might get to that point quicker and easier. That's just the timeline they're on. Other people, it might take a few not so good experiences to learn those lessons of how to set boundaries, how to communicate properly, and
Mm,
express in safe places when you done your homework to that you could do that. And again, none of this is in a book that you can necessarily read as a blueprint, because each
yeah.
person that we meet could be a reflection of someone we knew in our past that gave us a certain experience. And so it takes
Mm,
meeting different people along the way, and knowing that it can be a different experience. If we're open and
yeah.
allowing of that to happen, we can change
Mm,
how future interactions happen, which is why the wounded masculine discussion is so relevant. Because until a man does the inner work to
mm,
heal some of those hurts, it's going to resurface with every person and place that he goes to where he had that experience, until he gets that good one that he can, like, I'm going to replicate this. This is what I want. This feels great. I don't
yeah.
have to wear my mask. And so,
Yeah.
again, I appreciate you coming on the Men's Room Show today, being vulnerable by sharing your story, and even speaking to some of the things that you have experienced and how you were able to navigate through them. Because I think
Mm,
it wouldn't do any of the listeners justice if you just said, well, I did the self-development work and it was the best thing I ever
mm,
did, and here I am today. No, we have to hear about the hitting rock bottom,
yeah.
the 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 different physical things that actually happened in you, and you ignored them and suppressed them until they, as you said, jumped out like a jack in the box. That
Mm,
I love that analogy, because that is exactly what happens. And
yeah. Yeah. I just wanted to say, just to finish on my side, that we've talked about the healing of the wounded masculine, but I use that specific term rather than healed because I think it's a journey rather than a destination. And I think it's an iterative process. It's something you have to keep coming back to. I was only chatting to someone the other day around the fact that, this last week, I think I've lent into my wounded masculine a bit too much with striving and overdoing. But then a week before, I was in a much more measured place. So checking in with yourself, because we live in a world governed by the wounded masculine. So if you don't do a check-in, if you don't look at how things are going, the default will be back to strive, 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 drive, 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 burn out, burn out, burn out. So it takes us to consciously and intentionally check in with ourselves where we're at, and then seeing, okay, well, how can I lean more into that softer side? Do I need to put in place sort of a morning practice of some description, whatever that looks like? um, to set myself up for the day. And that could look like anything for anybody, going for a walk, doing a bit of journaling, but something softer than just to wake up, grab phone, hard drive, run, run, run on the treadmill, try and get to sleep, wake up at 3, 4 a.m. with cortisol rise. There's more to life than that. And there's ways of bringing more into life than that. I say that in a really compassionate way because I've been there. But I just also want to just reiterate that point that it's a journey.
It is, and it's never finished. That's thank you for bringing that back up, because a lot of people think that they could go through coaching, they could go for therapy, they get to a place and they're said and done. And like, no, you might go ahead 5 levels to go back 7, let's say. And so to think that you're one and done, that's the wrong message. That's not the message that I think that we're sending. We're saying, check in with yourself, check in with others, and do it early and often so that you could pivot. And the ultimate goal about this human experience that we're living is to live with peaceful purpose, right? So we want to be in alignment with who we are, and we want to live to our purpose. And then that's where the fulfillment comes. Anything short of that, then that means that's our indicator that there's more work to do. And so we go back to do the work, go through the process, make the changes, move ahead. It's just iterative. And if you think about life as an iterative process, that's ebbing and flowing, and that we're going to see all the different pieces, and that the goal is not to have everything be on a perfection level, that you're going to have the messy parts too, and be appreciative of both of those parts when they
yeah love that. Powerful stuff.
Yes. And so I guess at this point, I'm thinking that we would leave our listeners with an intention and a thought going forward about how they can consider how they choose to model vulnerability.
Yes. Yeah. By showing up for yourself first, and then by showing up for yourself, you're actually showing up for others. You're showing up for your children, because you're telling your children that boys can cry. You're telling your children, the girls that men can be vulnerable. You're telling your partner that you can be vulnerable in a relationship, but you also can provide a space for your partner to be vulnerable. And then you're showing your friends that actually it's okay to go through a rough patch. So modeling vulnerability has this ripple effect on everyone around you. So if you're not going to do it for anybody else, start doing it for other people. And I'm not saying that that's the place that you want to come at it at, because you want to be putting yourself first with this. But if you feel like that's too much for the moment, and you've got a family, for example, know that by doing the work, you are actually helping your family.
Beautifully said. I appreciate that sentiment, Max. It's been a pleasure having you on the Men's Room Show. And so if someone would like to get in a conversation with you, what is the best way that they could reach out to you?
Yes, they can just visit my website, which is Max Wilson Coaching. That's 1L on Wilson. Or it's the same on LinkedIn. They can send me a DM on LinkedIn. as well. Best
Thank you.
Thank you.